We flew across the country just to see him smile, but the moment the door swung open, the warmth drained entirely from my body. My daughter was still holding a handmade Best Dad card, her eyes wide with innocent excitement. But my eyes were fixed on the man standing in front of me, my husband of 14 years. He wasn't alone, but it wasn't a standard betrayal you might expect. Behind him, draped over the hotel armchair, was a piece of clothing I recognized instantly because it belonged to someone who had supposedly died 3 years ago. The air in that Chicago hallway turned to ice as the web of lies we had lived in for over a decade collapsed in a single heartbeat. Follow my story until the end to discover the shocking truth, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my voice has reached. My name is Ariana Bradford. At 43 years old, I honestly believed I had managed to secure the kind of peaceful, perfect life most women only dream of. I owned a successful boutique, and for 14 years, I was happily married to David, a hardworking executive at a logistics firm. Together, we had a beautiful 10-year-old daughter named Lily, who was the absolute center of our universe. David was the kind of father who never missed a school play and the kind of husband who still left sweet notes on the kitchen counter. So, when he came home looking stressed, explaining that an emergency corporate merger required him to catch an immediate weekend flight to Chicago, I did not hesitate to help him pack. I kissed him goodbye, completely oblivious to the shadow looming over us. It was Lily's sweet voice the next morning that set everything in motion. As we sat eating breakfast, she looked up with sparkling eyes and said, "Mom, let us go surprise Dad in Chicago for his birthday." She held up a colorful handmade card she had spent all morning drawing. It felt like a harmless, beautiful adventure. I smiled, logged into my computer, and used my saved airline miles to book 2 tickets for the very next flight. As I zipped our suitcases shut, my heart was incredibly light. I had absolutely no idea that this specific trip would end up completely destroying my entire life as I had always known it. The storm outside O'Hare International Airport was raging violently as our plane touched down on the tarmac. Heavy waves of Chicago rain lashed against the windows of our taxi as we drove toward the city center, the skyline blurred by dense gray fog. My daughter Lily was practically vibrating with excitement in the seat next to me, clutching her handmade card tightly, completely unfazed by the miserable weather outside. We pulled up to the historic Drake Hotel, where David always stayed whenever his logistics firm sent him into town for corporate business. The lobby was warm and opulently decorated, a stark contrast to the freezing downpour outside. Initially, my plan was to sit by the grand piano and simply call his cell phone from the front desk to let him know we had arrived. But Lily pulled on my sleeve, her eyes pleading as she begged, "Please, Mom, let us go straight up and knock on his door. It will be the ultimate surprise." The front desk clerk smiled warmly at Lily's enthusiasm, checked the registry, and confirmed that David was registered in room 714 on the 7th floor. She handed me an electronic key card with a sympathetic nod. As we stepped into the elevator and watched the floor numbers slowly count upward, a bizarre, suffocating knot suddenly began to tighten in the deep recesses of my stomach. It was an unexplainable, icy wave of raw maternal intuition that whispered something was terribly wrong, but I forced a smile for my daughter anyway. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime on the 7th floor, and Lily eagerly ran ahead down the long, carpeted corridor until she found room 714. She turned back to me with a massive, triumphant grin and knocked loudly on the heavy wood. Within seconds, the latch turned, and David opened the door. The moment his eyes landed on us, his face underwent a horrific, instantaneous transformation. The color completely drained from his skin, and his expression shifted from mild confusion to utter terror. He didn't smile. He didn't reach out to hug his daughter. He just stood there completely frozen in the doorway, as if he were looking at a pair of ghosts. "Ariana? Lily? What on earth are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice trembling violently as he tried to block the view of the room behind him. But it was too late. My eyes had already looked past his shoulder, darting into the brightly lit hotel room, and that was the exact moment time stopped completely. Draped casually over the back of a leather armchair was a very distinctive, custom-tailored emerald green silk scarf. My breath caught sharply in my throat, and the air in my lungs turned to pure ice. I recognized that specific scarf instantly because it belonged to my older sister, Elena. The problem was, Elena had supposedly perished in a tragic offshore boating accident in Europe 3 long years ago. Her body had never been recovered, a devastating loss that had completely shattered my family and left David acting as the sole executor of her massive, missing estate. Yet there it was sitting in my husband's room. Before I could even process the impossible sight of the scarf, a woman calmly stepped out of the adjacent bathroom, drying her hands on a towel. It was Elena. She was alive, well, and looking completely unbothered. My mind spun into total chaos. David quickly grabbed my arm, panic flashing in his eyes, and forcefully shoved both me and a thoroughly confused Lily inside the room, slamming the heavy wooden door shut behind us to prevent a public scene in the corridor. Lily looked between us, her innocent eyes darting back and forth as she asked in a small, frightened voice why Annalena was here when she was supposed to be in heaven. I ignored him entirely, looked straight at my sister, and demanded an immediate explanation for this living nightmare. Elena's eyes welled with tears as she broke down and confessed the entire sordid truth. 3 years ago, she had gotten deeply entangled with dangerous international corporate debts that threatened to ruin her. To escape her creditors, she and David had meticulously staged her tragic disappearance. David had utilized his high-ranking position at the logistics company, along with his legal role as the executor of her estate, to quietly and systematically funnel Elena's hidden millions into complex offshore corporate shell accounts. They had kept the money entirely safe from the banks, away from the authorities, and completely hidden from me. For 3 long years, my husband had been comforting me over my sister's tragic death, while simultaneously helping her hide a stolen fortune in plain sight. The momentary guilt on David's face suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating sneer that I had never seen before in our 14 years of marriage. He stepped toward me, his supportive husband persona completely disintegrating into nothingness. His voice was completely devoid of warmth as he explained that this trip to Chicago was never about a corporate logistics merger. This weekend was the final, critical meeting to permanently transfer the remaining offshore millions into a secure, untraceable trust. Once that final wire went through, his plan was to return home, quietly file for divorce, vanish entirely, and join Elena abroad to start a glamorous new life together. Lily began to cry, clinging tightly to my waist, but David looked down at our daughter with absolute indifference. He leaned in close and calmly delivered a chilling ultimatum. He told me that if I went to the police, called the authorities, or attempted to expose their fraudulent scheme to anyone, the resulting legal fallout from staging Elena's death would instantly freeze every single one of our joint family bank accounts. He had intentionally tied our home and all our personal savings directly into his logistics company's financial framework. Exposing them would mean total financial ruin for me. He coldly stated that I would be left completely bankrupt, utterly homeless, and entirely unable to provide for or support Lily. He smiled cruelly, confident that he had backed me into a corner from which I could never escape, leaving me to suffer the consequences of his ultimate betrayal. I forced my trembling hands to steady, letting a wave of artificial defeat wash over my face. I looked down at the floor, pretending to be utterly broken by his cruel ultimatum, and whispered that I needed 24 hours to process this nightmare at a nearby hotel before signing any separation paperwork. David and Elena exchanged a smug, victorious glance, completely convinced that their threats had successfully intimidated me into absolute submission. They carelessly waved their hands and let me walk out of that room with Lily. The very second the heavy door of room 714 clicked shut behind us, my devastated demeanor completely vanished. I reached deep into my front jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone, stopping the audio recording application that had been quietly running the entire time. I had captured every single word of their confession, their fraudulent schemes, and his blatant financial blackmail. Instead of panicking or fleeing to a hotel, I firmly grabbed Lily's hand, walked out of the Drake Hotel, and hailed a taxi straight to the office of a prominent corporate defense attorney in downtown Chicago. I laid everything out on his desk. Within an hour, we had turned the crystal-clear audio recording, along with my personal administrative access logs to David's domestic logistics financial databases, over to federal investigators. They had spent 3 long years hunting for Elena's missing millions, and I had just handed them the entire roadmap on a silver platter. David thought he had backed an innocent woman into a helpless corner, but he had actually handed me the weapon to destroy him. 6 months later, the dust finally settled, and justice was served with absolute precision. Utilizing my secret recording and the clear financial trails, federal authorities arrested David and Elena for multi-million-dollar wire fraud and insurance scams. David's hidden assets were completely seized by the court. However, because I was proven to be an entirely innocent party, the judge awarded me full ownership of our family home and significant restitution, ensuring absolute long-term security for Lily and myself. My sudden trip to Chicago saved us from a life built entirely on a monstrous lie. What would you do if you found yourself in my place? Have you ever experienced a betrayal like this? Comment your thoughts below. Meanwhile, I am leaving 2 other shocking stories on the screen that you will definitely love. Thank you so much for watching until the very end.